please don't insult the United States. We don't have a Hannibal Directive. All right. October 7th was a military defeat. October 7th was where the Hamas came across the border and took you by surprise. They killed nearly 400 Israeli military personnel. The remaining people, about 800, the majority of them were killed by you and your military, who hunted them down because of the Hannibal Directive. We now know that the vast majority of Israeli civilians killed on October 7th were killed by the IDF, by Apache helicopters, by tanks, by your own soldiers. The Israelis say as they were driving us, the hostages, as they were driving us back into Gaza, we were attacked by helicopters. One lady, you killed my husband, you killed my child, I was wounded. We know the Israelis slaughtered their own people. Benjamin Netanyahu, do not equate America with that, because as bad as we are, we don't kill our own people, you son of a bitch.
Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours.
Thursday, May 16th, 2024. Thank you for joining me today. And here we are, at least in the first setup of the new location. And I will be giving you guys a little roundabout view here, not in this show, but in probably our Substack and on social media in the next couple of days once I get more set up. But I do want your guys' thoughts on where we are, because this is just kind of the first interim moment. I have more thoughts, let's put it that way, on what I think I want to do here. And this is one of the different locations, Pirate Stream and so on. But, I think simple is best. I want your guys' thoughts on it in general. But first and foremost, a shout out to everybody out there who's supporting The Last American Vagabond, who is, in the process of supporting us against all of the attacks that we're going through. And just, we couldn't do any of this without you. So thank you for all of your ongoing support, because it's, whether it's TLAV or other independent media, it's never been a more important time, in my opinion, in history to support, I guess I was going to say alternative media, independent media, but, I would try to frame it in a way that would be not electronic related, just resistance, people pushing back against the power. I think that's where we really are. And I think that's kind of the resonating feeling that most people are having, that we can do that it is possible to stand up and recognize that we are powerful if we actually look beyond our party lines or divisions, the lines drawn through the middle of us, left and right, up and down, horizontal by the power structure, like we saw with the COVID-19 illusion, where they were so desperate to get us to think that it was partisan. And it was self-evidently not. And I think the same thing about what we're going to talk about today, or what we have been talking about in regard to what is one of the biggest things that I've ever covered in regard to, and I'm not even just talking about the genocide, but the way that this conversation has changed the world in positive ways, but also in negative ways. And I think it's important to see that. And like, even comparing it to like how big the medical experimentation that we call the COVID-19 illusion really was and continues to be. I have some points I'm going to start with on that. I was just talking about this today, that what we're seeing, the genocide itself is, I've said, I stand by it. We're going to talk about that for the next 1,000 years. I mean, this is a huge moment, terrible moment, but because of the size, because of the shifting political dynamics, because of how much this will change, this is going to be something that people talk about. And also because of the interesting overlap of propaganda in the electronic age, the technocratic age, the deep fake element. I mean, so many different things. This will be talked about for a long time. My point was that just comparatively, I think that what we're dealing with here is, if not at the same level of how important and how world-changing the COVID-19 illusion was, both on awareness, also the byproducts, the negative consequences of what was done and things that people ignored, but also just because of how much suffering it's causing and the world around. So we're going to talk today about a couple of important things. It's going to be, every time I say this, I always slap myself because I almost never follow through with it being shorter, but I believe today is going to be, only because I tried to do only a couple of topics and a lot of the time was done setting up in here. But my point is that we have two main things that we're going to get into, one of which is really fascinating, really horrible. I was following some coverage from Ryan Grimm in regard to a post that he found, and we'll go through all of this, coming from Hamas and different related aspects of coverage that they're pointing out, their Facebook channels and everything else, where they were arguing that they were engaged with IDF, and that because of the way that they had, to make it quick in this opening, has succeeded or put them in a position of insecurity, that Israel decided to just bomb the entire location, including with IDF members present. Now, that was just an unconfirmed statement that, still to this point, is a statement made by people that claim that they were there, Hamas members, which there's no reason we should blindly take at face value what Hamas says, just like we should not blindly take at face value what Israel says. That seems like a pretty common thing we should understand. But now we have a story that it's developed around that, where Israel stands up and says, we accidentally killed our own people, which I find it hard to believe they would ever announce that without people pointing to it, which I think is possibly what happened. But also I think it's because it's about setting a narrative. And we're going to get into this. The many times this has already happened, the many hostages that have been shot publicly, in the sense that they were in front of other IDF members, one of which was essentially got away and was screaming behind the buildings like, don't shoot me. And they called him out and they shot him anyway. Again, I've said this many times. I don't know how you look at that situation and think that that was an accident. Sure, it certainly could be, I guess. But this is what we're going to talk about today in regard to a new example of this that is bigger than just a couple of people, but it just what appears to be a strategic, or it could be a strategic choice to avoid anything worse than saying, whoopsie, we accidentally killed people, which, friendly fire happens kind of a thing. And, you guys can decide for yourselves. I think it's very clear that I don't think anybody can dispute the reality, seeing as how they have a literal directive called the Hannibal Directive that is about killing your own people to avoid the downside of what might happen if they're taken. It's exactly what that is, and it's a public thing at this point. We'll show you the colonel who's discussed this as happening on October 7th. This would be... there was something else I was going to go with there, but the point is ultimately that this would be a choice from an institutional level, from a government level, from a level of, whether we're talking about the way we perceive power and the voting in, people are supposed to take care of their constituents, or just a level of just power structures that are disregarding anything we pretend we care about, international law, deciding to kill their own people to avoid what that might look like. And then even saying that we killed our own people, and as if that's, I don't know, we'll get into it all today. I think it's really interesting to see that being the choice. And as we've seen so far, that Israel has failed to announce or discuss or highlight anything that they don't think will be benefiting their situation. So I find it odd that they would point to something like this. Now, we're also going to talk about a couple of other very huge lies that are being shown, which of course flavor this conversation, is how many times they seem to lie about very, very easily proven things. And this gets into some interesting overlaps of the same kind of story of UNRWA and shooting police escorts of food aid, and then saying that, look, Hamas, they're not even escorting the aid anymore because you continue to shoot the people that are claiming they're Hamas, but there's no evidence that they are Hamas. And the same cycle has continued. And at the moment, we just highlighted, they killed their first, not UNRWA member, but international UN staff member who was there. Immediately, all these other stories spin up. The story about the United Nations having the numbers of the Gaza death toll, which is a complete fabricated lie. We'll go over in depth again. Well, we briefly mentioned it. We're going to go over extremely in depth today. It's fascinating to me to see how this reverberated through all of the supposed high-minded journalists out there who just parroted the story, and many of which still to this moment are parroting that story, standing by it, shouting people down for telling them they're wrong, even though the link they're giving you proves that they're wrong. It's almost unparalleled. I have never seen it like this. And I think that's a combination of that they're just that bad at their jobs and haven't even realized that blindly accepting what they're handed is not what journalism is, and people that are knowingly lying for other very dark reasons, a multifaceted grouping of them. Point, though, is that we're talking about these other stories that spun up to kind of cover that and other examples of them shooting the UN members. But this one is about, we'll talk about policemen escorting the UN, which is what this is. UNRWA, there are official entities that exist in Gaza. And remember, because of the way, as we now know, that the Israeli government manipulated into making Hamas in power. That's the reality. They sent them funding. They made sure, as many officials have stated, that they would be in power, which again adds a whole lot of doubt to the claim of an election taking place. We know it did, but whether it was real or not is my question. Not that I know. My point, though, is that they made sure they were in power, which then, by default, after 2006, made sure that everybody there, whether wanting to be overlapped with Hamas or not, was forced to work through them to get to anything that had to do with any government overlap, social processes. So people who are policemen had to work through that. So now you've got this narrative where they are no matter what, and they're shooting all these policemen. Now you've got examples of them while they're getting caught shooting UN members, while they're getting caught bombing people, that they just go, oh, look, we caught the UN on video with a bunch of terrorists. And every major person in this conversation is pointing at this when it's as easy as anything in this conversation to show these are policemen. Now, could you argue they might also? Sure. You could argue that about anything we're talking about. They're not proving that. There's no evidence to suggest that they are Hamas other than the things I just discussed, the possible overlaps, and yet it continues to reverberate. It's just like the false UN numbers, or the claim that the numbers have been halved, which is false. And we're also going to talk about some other unnerving things that are taking place to end with. But let's start with a couple of points I think are very important. So we're not just, there we go. So we're keeping up, let's put it that way, on some of these other stories that I do think are very important. One of which in general is just to make sure that we're continuing to recognize that Twitter is not a free speech platform. Okay, here is Alex Rubinstein highlighting that Kit Clarenberg was censored, which we highlighted. Now, you could argue, as we showed, the things that at least I'm moderately sure that what they were highlighting was what he was censored for. And yeah, the statements were a little bit, what's the right word for it? I mean, frankly, it doesn't matter. They're all protected by free speech. My point is that there was something that you could argue was, may have bothered you, that he said something that may have been taken as insulting or whatever. And it was in the context of Zionism and Israel and what's going on. And I think it was about the idea of hostages. And, like, for instance, and this is not what he did, but the argument of one of these Zionist supporters out there saying, I hope you get raped, like that kind of conversation, where it ends up being something where you're like, oh, yeah, well, you're supporting these people. Well, I hope it ends up falling in your lap. That kind of a sentiment. I can't remember exactly what the words were. My point was, in no way was what he said as bad as the things we see currently being displayed all across Twitter. And on top of that, it was protected under free speech. He was expressing his opinion. Nothing of it even remotely violated the rules of Twitter, but he was censored. And guess what? This is the most important part. And they upheld that decision. Now, usually what I've seen is people like this, usually prominent, get a slap on the wrist. Right. And that's not to say anything against Kit Clarenberg, because ultimately the point is that they do this and it's about pressure. People in the community like Alex, whoever, they reach out and they say something and eventually they pull back because they, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. But this is a big name to ultimately be censored and upheld for getting mass reported by Zionists. Now, regardless of what you think about what he said or this is not free speech. Otherwise, we should be very clear. What is exactly the problem here? What did he say? What was the violation? None of this is accountable anymore. Anyway, I hope we recognize that. There's a lot more than just Kit, but it's important to see that this is not going in the direction we want it to. Now, another important note that I just wanted to highlight, it's kind of sporadic points to start. Justice Department formally moves, and we mentioned this briefly a moment ago or a couple shows ago, moves to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug in historic shift. I call BS. I think this is a cowardly sidestepping move that doesn't really change the illegality, and it just moves it to a lower class. That's all this is. That's all this is. And it drives me bananas that we're talking about something that is one of the most widely recognized substances that is not what they claim it is, that is not dangerous. Even this, I bet you Alex Burness and his head's exploding, seeing as how to him, it's, I always make fun of him for that because clearly I think he was blind when it came to COVID, cannabis. And my point was the same people that were lying to us about COVID were the same people that lied to us about cannabis. We couldn't piece together. I think it's because he has some seminal work on cannabis that brought him up in his career. And it's just ridiculous. Reefer Madness style nonsense if you get into it. And we've broken it down extensively. My point, though, is that it's going from class 1 to class 3. Now, what's crazy is that it's even still in class 1 alongside the worst and most dangerous drugs, which ultimately means, which, by the way, in my opinion, none of this should be the reality. You as an adult should be able to do anything you want to your own body in the safety of your own home or elsewhere, as long as you're not putting people in danger. That, because other laws are in place for that kind of thing, is what it should be. That's freedom. That's actual liberty. But they're telling you can't take these things because we're the adults and you don't know any better. But one, meaning no medical value and highly addictive. Both of those are false. Provably, scientifically false. Now, of course, in the addiction side of this, I've gone through in depth. The point is that there you can literally be addicted to anything. You can jog so much that you become addicted to the concept of jogging. These are scientific discussions. I've gone through this in depth. I often highlight Aaron Mate's father, who has amazing work on addiction, which really breaks down that we don't fully, or maybe we intentionally don't understand it really. It's different than just the chemical addiction substance concept. But nonetheless, my point is the scientific research around this endlessly, just like with the COVID conversation that we all trust the science and ignore, not we all, but you know who I'm talking about, says very clearly that these things are not the reality. And especially when you realize that going back to the 80s, the United States government had programs using medical cannabis for medical use. And they yet still go zero medical possibilities and put it in Schedule 1 all the way to this day. But now they're going to move it to Schedule 3, which is, I'll just read this, if approved, which by the way, doesn't even happen yet, the rule would move marijuana away from its current classification as Schedule 1 alongside heroin and LSD. Pot, just love that. Marijuana cigarettes would instead be a Schedule 3 substance alongside ketamine and anabolic steroids. Right, because it's as dangerous as ketamine or anabolic steroids, or how about this? Or as dangerous as Vicodin or mushrooms, psilocybin? Frankly, I think, I'm not trying to say that any of these things are necessarily dangerous in the sense of moderation. That's my bigger point. But think about how crazy it is to take something. I'll include this, by the way. One I just recently wrote for the Substack, The Cannabis Deception, How the Government Stole Your Future. And you know what? Since we're talking about it, this larger article I wrote a long time ago and reposted, I think, at least once, so the date will be updated. And I think I still have it in there. Yeah, 2016 was originally published. The top 10 marijuana myths that no one should believe. And it goes through all of them and has linked source material to each one of them. Make sure you understand this stuff because it's a lie. We have been deceived like everything else. My point, though, is that how crazy it is that that's supposed to be a positive step, so you just downgrade the illegality of it. This is the kind of nonsensical government action we get. They're like, okay, we have a thing that's completely beneficial for you that can change the world, that can literally make better textiles, better medicine, better, but we're not gonna make it not illegal. We're just gonna make it a little less. I can't even say that properly. My point is that instead of doing the right thing, they just go, we'll make it illegal, but not as illegal. Is that okay? Are we still okay? Can I still put you in prison if I want to? This is the kind of thing your government does to hope it pacifies you. We should be marching through the streets going, this is ridiculous. But, we're focusing on bigger things, obviously. I just want us to recognize that the kind of half measure, which is really almost a detriment, is the kind of thing they do when they're dealing with foreign policy or anything else. They pacify, a better word I was looking for is not pacify, but try to, it's not coming. Ultimately, they try to pacify and hope that you just stop paying attention. Appease? No, that's not the right one. We'll come back to it. Now, I also want to discuss a couple of more opening points in regard to medical freedom before we go through these last two. And I see this is the thing. You guys can laugh at me. When I know that I'm having less content, I seem to bloviate a lot more in the beginning and a lot more things like that. And then that's why it takes longer. I should shut up, Ryan. Let's keep going. So the last American Vagabond, I posted this. This is a new study right here. And this was from March 12th, 2024. I actually thought I guess I forgot who I grabbed it from. I wanted to give him a shout out. In any case, an important study. Methodological considerations regarding the quantification of DNA impurities. I think it was Jessica Rose off the top of my head. In the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine community. Now, think about how crazy it is that we're at a point, and I'll even show you something next, people still tripling down on the fact that it's all safe and effective, and anyone saying otherwise is a conspiracy theorist. And yet we're continually finding new things like this, new peer-reviewed science that doesn't even get discussed, doesn't even get pointed to by the Fox News, CNN, MSNBC apparatus. Here's what it says. I'll just go right to the image on the conclusions. The available information and data indicate that the ready-to-use mRNA vaccine community, so Pfizer, contains DNA impurities, which we already know. McKernan and plenty of others have been screaming about this, that exceed the permitted limit value by several hundred times, and in some cases, even more than 500 times. So you're taking something that has 500 times the permitted level of DNA impurities. We've gone over this. That's horrifying. There are so many different things that can happen here, and we're watching it. Look at what's going on in the world. But guess what? When you look at all the problems, they're baffled, guys. They're baffled. So here's the evidence that go, if this is the case, it's going to cause a lot of these dangerous things. Then look over here and go, man, look at all these dangerous things. And yet they can't connect those dots, or they don't want to. I think we all know that there's a huge part of the apparatus, the system that recognizes they were wrong or knew they were lying and are just dug in like a tick and will never acknowledge that this was the reality. The whole Scott Adams routine. I was right, even though I was wrong, I was still right. And even though you were right, you were still wrong because you just got lucky. And even though I'm wrong, I made the right choices as an expert should have. And it turned out it's just like, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely crazy. The truth is the science was there. We were highlighting it like a lot of the doctors that got censored were, and we're not just making things up. This is the same point. Now, where are the Scott Adams now? Why aren't they highlighting? Maybe he is, but so much of this is completely lost in the conversation because there's bigger things going on in the world. It says, and that this went unnoticed, it says, because the DNA quantification carried out as part of the batch testing only at the active substance level appears to be methodologically inadequate. You know why? Using a PCR test. Oh my God, who could have seen that coming? This is designed. I don't see how it's possible that the same failings can continue to be present and continue to be the reason why we didn't see the thing that would have accidentally shown that we were wrong or that we were hurting people. That's called a self-serving mistake, if you will, that they're using the thing that they knew they could later go, oops, that's why we didn't notice it. But that's the thing we were going, that's not working. That's not supposed to work in this case. You're lying about that. Cycle thresholds. It's over and over and over. This is such extreme criminality, and no one's even talking about it. Other than the people you expect. Kevin McKernan, who I highlight because I think he was one of the earliest people on this conversation, and plenty of the others. I talked about the misfolding proteins with Jessica Rose, the truncated spike proteins, like all of this stuff, guys. These are proven realities at this point, and no one's even talking about it. Now, my point is that we have talked a lot about it. These aren't new topics necessarily. I just wanted to make sure you weren't missing these updates. Now, here's what's crazy. This is from BBC. This is written 17 hours ago. Here's what's hilarious to me, by the way. You know, so many of these are like, experts fear or scientists say. Funny how this one just says, expert, singular, fears vaccine theories are a fact. Think about how desperate that is. So you can't find more than one expert to throw on your title? So you made an entire article today about one random guy who stands up and goes, I'm afraid about conspiracy theorists misleading people. That's it. There's no science in this. There's nothing to back it up. He just has a doctor. He wears a white coat and he says he's scared. Let's write a whole article about it, despite the fact that everything we have in front of us now proves that he's that he's wrong or he's deciding to lie to us. And it says a health expert, I think that's hilarious, is worried conspiracy theorists about vaccines could be affecting uptake. You don't say. How about it's because the conspiracy theorists are scientifically proven? We're talking about peer-reviewed science. I just showed you one of them. So here's my point. If I show you that, look, these same things, these telling you are safe and effective can have 500 times the amount of DNA irregularities that can cause any number of serious problems. Is that me listening to conspiracy theorists? No, that's me going, I'm going to educate myself about the science and I'm going to make that informed decision, which means I'm not going to get the thing that might hurt me. Conspiracy theory. And yes, it's affecting uptake because we're not crazy, because most people are not children that are going to blindly follow the lead. And it says, in recent years, there has been a growth in online conspiracy theories, which suggest vaccines, like the COVID jab, are dangerous or ineffective. Like, literally the definition of dangerous and ineffective. But it says, Mr. Ward said he's worried that people may believe the conspiracy theories. You know, this is why they keep it opaque. Which ones? Highlight one for me, if you will. No, because then you'll go, well, that's obvious. Like, what conspiracy theory? That it causes myocarditis? That it can cause blood clots? That you just literally pulled the AstraZeneca vaccine like we told you from the very beginning, even though that's the least dangerous of all of them? Conspiracy theory. Don't believe it. And it says, but he insists they are just that. They're just conspiracy theories. What I'm going on is facts. You know, the one that you don't care to list off for us. This is all just narrative on BBC with this guy's picture. Make sure you recognize and make a note. This is Derek Ward, a professor who is so shockingly wrong or so shockingly dishonest that he should not have a job in this field. It says Professor Ward is also concerned about the number of children completing a vaccination program, which can include multiple jabs until they reach primary school age. Well, yeah, because nobody believes in the system anymore. And you know what? I can even argue that maybe that is the wrong move. I don't think so. I disagree. But you could argue that maybe because of the overcompensation of our awareness, not hypothetical, but the awareness of your dishonesty, the awareness of your medical experimentation, the awareness of the shockingly high amount of effects that aren't necessarily side effects that seem to be designed, that we're going, what else is wrong? What other shots have been lied about? Right? That's just common sense. And so people are going, time out. Even people that wanted them in the past or still think it might be right are just uncertain. That's logic. That's what we should be doing. Now, my point is that maybe the overcompensation will end up causing more disease. I don't think that. I'm very, very much on the line that I think that the entire industry, because of the intent behind it, not necessarily because the science or the process could be wrong. I don't know, because I don't believe any of them anymore. I leave it open. That the intent is why it is hurting people, because they're not either concerned about the fallout or because they're trying to make it happen. I don't think those are scientifically untenable claims at this point. But anyway, the point is that this is the kind of thing they're pushing forward. Lastly, don't miss this. The Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus Pandemic put out, and this was the 15th, today, based on evidence uncovered in the COVID Select's recent report, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services commenced formal debarment proceedings against EcoHealth Alliance. You realize this is not some grandstanding politician in Congress. This is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, probably because of a rising awareness of what really happened, or because the COVID Select Committee and because of, opportunist politicians, I think, that want to make something because of the things that are all so shockingly aware of to most people, the lies around this whole conversation, that they decided to try to make it happen for themselves. In any case, HHS is now at least beginning formal debarment. Now, who knows where it goes? I'm very skeptical that this may just be theater. But remember, EcoHealth Alliance played a serious role in all this. Let me grab a couple of articles in case you want to read them more on this. Let's see. Maybe that's the right one. Yeah, I'll just include that one. Revisiting Fort Detrick, vaping overlap, COVID origins as EcoHealth restarts coronavirus work. Remember, that was on May 10th of 2023. So God only knows what they've been doing since, which I think to some degree we know. We've talked about it. And it says EcoHealth will now face an immediate government-wide suspension of taxpayer funds, including a hold on all active grants. Now, what do you think the odds are that action becomes the justification for why they, whoopsie, something went wrong? Oops, this thing got out. And it's all your fault because you paused funding and we weren't able to do the things we needed to do. That might be one of the ways this goes too. I'm just theorizing, how dangerous it is to theorize these days. Just consider where this could go, and don't always believe that the Republicans or Democrats, the government is acting in your best interest. I think that's usually a safe bet, to assume that they're not. Don't assume that they don't question at all. Consider that they might be the opposite. I'll include this as well. Now, let's get into this discussion of a possible Hannibal Directive Act. And I think this is really interesting because of the timing of it all. So first and foremost, May 15th, Ryan Grimm posts this. Hamas is claiming that it attacked Israeli troops and the IDF was unable to evacuate the tank. So the IDF bombed the entire area. Claim of 12 casualties. And it's basically just writing the same thing. Now, you can find these Al-Qasim brigades and, Telegram channels, which are officially clear, which I always find interesting, by the way. I guess it is Telegram, but I would question why they would allow that to continue, seeing as how they just censor everything everywhere. But you have Hamas channels that are Hamas channels. And so the point was they posted this. Now, whether it's accurate, always question. It could be a lie. It could be, propaganda effort. The point, as of the 16th, this is a report that came out. So first of all, Johnny Graz, just simply, the report is, and we'll read it next, 5 Israeli soldiers killed, 7 injured in northern Gaza after IDF tank mistook them for an enemy. Now, this even the article seems to not really believe that, which is kind of crazy to me. Now, what he said is, looks like Israel finally managed to kill some terrorists. You guys can think of that what you will. Here's what the article says. Realizing again, so this is posted today, that yesterday this was claimed. So it doesn't mean that it has to be true, but what's interesting is it shows that Hamas had some knowledge of this. So it could be that they were present or saw this and decided to lie about it to get ahead of the story. But yeah, it's, logically, it feels like a much more likely scenario that this is something they were involved in, pointed it out, and then As usual, the reactive propaganda of the Israeli government is reactive as hell. And they go, oh, no, and they make the, I'm not saying that's the case, but 45 times since October 7th, I've shown you how that works, where something gets exposed, like the Flower Massacre, and you get 14 channels that come out and make reactive propaganda around it. And usually falls on its face within 3 days, but it still has an effect in those moments. So here's what they write as of today. 5 Israeli soldiers killed, 7 injured after an IDF tank mistook them for enemies. Which I don't even know how you write mistook because of what this reads right here, what they wrote. It says 5 Israeli soldiers were killed and another 7 wounded, including, and that, by the way, before I go, that was the 12 number right there. Interesting overlap. I mean, I think it's very clear that they saw the same thing. Whether they're lying about it, you can consider, but the numbers are too hard to ignore. And it says, in an incident of so-called, even they said so-called, and I guess they could be saying so-called friendly fire. That could mean they just don't like the term friendly fire, or maybe they're questioning whether it was friendly fire. You can decide. In northern Gaza's Jabalia yesterday, a place where they've been bombing left and right and killing civilians like crazy, even though it's an area they claim they already had secure. Now, the slain troops are named here if you want to read more about them. And here's, by the way, very, very telling that we're talking about 22, 22, 20, 20, 21. Those are the ages. Sort of like the Ukraine scenario where they're just they are pulling up their youngest because they're getting destroyed. And that's objective at this point. That's what Israel's people are saying. Haaretz has written an article saying we have already lost. It is time for us to accept that. Now, you could still argue it might not be true, but I think the evidence points very clearly in that direction. Here's the important part. The soldiers all served in the Paratroopers Brigade 202 Battalion. So that's interesting in case anybody has more insight into what that group was involved in, because here's some other overlaps of wondering whether this was something, well, I'll wait till I'm done reading this, just wondering whether there might have been something more dark involved here. Still Hannibal Directive, but, you know, realizing there's a lot of people involved. We've seen 3 different whistleblowers now that are part of the IDF that were anonymized. So, I mean, I wouldn't put it past them from taking out somebody who was revealing that they're committing crimes to the world as they're about to go to prison for crimes that they're committing, you know, from the ICC and the ICJ and so on. Or, you know, any number of overlaps like that, or people, or, you know, we'll get into it in a second. Now, it says, according to an initial IDF probe, a tank operating alongside the paratroopers, the group that were killed in the Jabalia camp, fired 2 shells at a building where they were gathered at around 7 p.m. Now, there's obvious to point out that if they didn't know it was them, how in the hell are we to pretend that 1, knew Hamas was there, which was the only way you're allowed to do that, and 2, that there were no civilians? Obviously, I think we all know that they aren't doing that in any circumstance, and that's why this is happening. The evidence is overwhelmingly clear. But it says the tank forces had arrived at the area in the morning hours, and several hours later, the paratroopers reached the area and established a post in that building. Okay, so the tanks arrived in the morning hours. And several hours after they were there, so I don't know how you wouldn't be able to see this if you're all focused in the same location. The paratroopers, the 20-year-olds, established a post inside the building. Later in the evening, another group of paratroopers reached the area and notified 2 of the tanks that they were entering the building. So now you've got one group that was there with them that went in. The tank drivers must know they're there. Then you have a secondary group that shows up and goes, we're going in the building too. Okay, so now you've got 2 different groups that are there. It says the tank forces had later identified, this seems to skip a whole part of the story, a gun barrel from one of the windows. You mean one of the windows in a building that you know people are in because they told you they were going in? Yes. And it says, and believed it was enemy forces. Okay, so let's just say hypothetically, knowing you've got 2 units inside the building, that you say, oh, I see an IDF gun right over there in one of the windows. What would be your logical response knowing there are 2 units in the building? Would bomb the building, which is what happened? Hardly. You would notify the people in the building. There's a Hamas member over there. They would probably engage, or maybe you would fire isolated in the one location. But it says leading them to fire 2 shells from the tank at the building. I don't even know how that makes possible sense. This is the okay, and just to rehash this one, it's the story I was just telling you. This was on December 18th, 2023. Hostages shot by IDF who were literally holding an SOS sign in Hebrew right? And I think their image is right. I mean, I don't know why. It's clear to me that they would not mistake these three people as Hamas. In any case, they were speaking in Hebrew. They were hostages. They came out with their hands up and waving a white flag. So even if they thought they were Hamas, that's not supposed to be people you shoot, which we know they are. And we're like, we are hostages. Please save us. Shot. Killed them both. One of them got away, ran behind the buildings. It's all written in here. 20 minutes. It took 20 minutes for them to coax the other guy out. Imagine what he's saying in that time frame. Don't shoot me. I'm an Israeli. I'm Jewish. I'm speaking in Hebrew. Okay. And then my point is they coaxed him out. Come on. You're okay. He walks out. Not one, but two of the IDF members shoot him dead. That's the story. You can read about it right here. And yet we're to believe that was a whoopsie. Accidentally. Oops, we didn't realize it was you who was telling us it was you the whole time and screaming you're an Israeli. Oopsie. Okay. So they went in the building. They shot the building after they went in knowing they were there because they claimed they saw a gun rifle. I mean, the same point applies that I don't want you to miss. Either they decided to kill all these people because of some other Hannibal Directive or because these people were saying things they didn't want them to say or any number of other possibilities, just hypothesizing. And that means that they couldn't have known that Hamas was there, right? Because they killed these people on accident, so they didn't know it was in there, and they definitely didn't know whether they were civilians. There's just no way around this, guy. This is an important event. It only really for those that have not been paying attention thus far. There's 45 different examples from the last 2 days that show you they're literally shooting and killing people for no reason. But I think this is exponentially important. Now, here, by the way, is one of the images of the bombing of an entire residential block in the middle of Jabalia refugee camp. Now, this is on the 16th, but this very well could be the bombing. I don't know. But the point is, it's just in the camp that we're talking about. And they literally exploded this whole building. See, now, there's just no way you pretend that they made sure if they're accidentally killing their own people in building, they're not checking these. They're destabilizing. They are destroying. They are completely leveling the area by the way that they've said many times they're going to level Gaza, building settlements. And yet we all pretend like we don't really know what's happening or the ones that don't want to see it. Now, let's not forget, in case you're just disputing the very concept of the Hannibal Directive, an Israeli colonel, amongst many others, by the way, tank drivers, helicopter pilots, the head security of the kibbutz Be'eri, all on the record saying they watched IDF shoot people. Yaz Porat, I believe, said she stood back and watched them fire tanks in a building where she knew they were civilians, watched her family die. People that came back from Gaza said they watched their family members die because of IDF bombings. I don't know how it's possible this much can be ignored. But the Israeli colonel on the record said this is a mass Hannibal, talking about October 7th, which is why I use that image again for the cover of the show today. The cars that they swept to the side because they didn't want you to see them scattered along the road. Because there's nobody else that could have done that besides their bombings. And even then, the actual munitions were only accessible to Israel. No Hamas mortar could have caused that from what they had. Watch it for yourself. As well as this interesting one, which I actually hadn't even seen. Doesn't surprise me, though. I've seen many different examples of the same conversation. But this is a Hebrew paper, Ynet News, from December 12th, 2023. It says 1/5, which it's way more than that, but this is them admitting, Israeli IDF reports admitting that 1/5 of all the fatalities on October 7th were due to friendly fire or accidents. Where is that conversation? So this is confirmed on the record in Israeli media by the IDF that 1/5 of all the people they killed were accidentally shooting our own people or friendly fire. Do you not realize how obvious that is? It's way more than 1/5, and that's why they're actually having to admit that. And this is coming out like a waterfall. And this is old. I'm surprised this hasn't gotten more attention, but we already know this. The Hannibal Directive, I think, is the most obvious part of what we're discussing. Very, very important. So keep an eye on this. We're going to continue to follow up on how this develops. Again, I think it's interesting to follow up on what the group's brigade was, what they might have been involved with. So overall, remember, the whole point of the Hannibal Directive is about taking out people on your side, Israelis, as the Israeli government, because they worried about how they will be used. And that's what it comes from. Hannibal Directive comes from a time when an Israeli, I think it was an official or a general or somebody high up, don't quote me on the exact title, but it was somebody high up that got taken and they were forced to exchange a huge amount of their prisoners and embarrass them. And so from that point forward, and it wasn't public at that point, it is now, they made the directive that said, okay, if this happens again, and we're sure he's going to be taken, we kill them. Because that's in the best interest of Israel, whatever the narrative is. Same thing the United States government does. It's not. You're killing your own people. It's a crime. But it's an undeniable reality. So what were these people doing? It could just be that they made an accident. Oops, we didn't mean to kill them because we're that bad at this, because we're not communicating, because we're not a real military. I mean, these are things we keep seeing. No real control over these individuals posting things on TikTok. Or it could be just that it sounds like, and Hamas reported the day before this came out, that they were winning and worried that they were going to take these people. They murdered all of them anyway. But it seems that there were some that were wounded. So it'd be interesting to see if some of them speak out, but I don't know if you would, realizing how easily they could just kill you and nobody's going to say anything about it. Or it could be any number. Well, I mean, I guess the Hannibal Directive is the real point, but I was going to tell you there could be variations of why. But the simple reality is they were killed. And with everything else that we can see behind this, we should at the very least be questioning whether they're just so desperate at this point that anything that goes awry, they don't want it to be seen, so they're willing to wipe it off the map. Now, if you don't think that's possible, and you don't believe that they're actually doing any of this, whether it's about Hannibal Directive or just killing Palestinians, I think this is an important report. Omar Shakir, who is the Israel and Palestine Director for Human Rights Watch, highlights this new 100-page report from a group called the University Network for Human Rights. And basically it has a human rights, that group and human rights centers at Yale, Cornell, University of Pretoria, and Boston University all find that Israel is in fact committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, and calls openly for the governments to avoid complicity and act to bring an end to the crime. Now, of course, it'll be dismissed as you're Hamas or whatever narrative, you're anti-Semitic, which is usually what we see, but that's increasingly and not entirely lost power because it's been lied about and misused. There is racism, but racism is not calling out the crimes of a government. Here's what it says. I think this is powerful. Genocide in Gaza, analysis of international law and its application to Israel's military action since October 7th. Now, this could be driven by the fact that they're basically attacking higher education, which I'll be the first to do as well from an American perspective, because I don't think it's even worth anybody's time anymore because of politics and whatever else. But that's not to say that we should allow a foreign entity to pretend like all the people involved are somehow racist and should be shut down and suppressed and censored. Free speech and all, protecting the worst of speech is the reality, whether that's what's happening or not. So you can recognize maybe a driving moment for these people to stand up and fight for that, feeling like they're being attacked, or that these people in these colleges support the protests or whatever else. Or it could just be that they recognize this is actual genocide and they care about that. Or they could be lying. Anything is possible. But I think the evidence we can list off here that you can read for yourself, that we can back up with actual citations, is the most easy thing to prove almost in all of my time doing this. Even over the COVID-19 conversation, this stuff is shockingly easy to prove, as I'll read right from what they said, as you've seen, as we've talked about. They are shamelessly saying this stuff. None of them are innocent. I mean, Alan Dershowitz just penned an article from New York Post saying how innocent are these Gazans? Like, just so detestable, disgusting. A person like Alan Dershowitz on his moral superiority? Epstein buddy? Right? Only in your underwear, though. I heard. It's just incredible. These are the people taking stances of moral superiority over, how gross these Gazans are. They're not really innocent at all. Meanwhile, pretending like you're only going after Hamas. But here's what it says, coming from major institutions around the world and University Network for Human Rights. In the light of the extraordinary implications of a finding that Israel may be committing genocide, that comes from the ICJ, the World Court, against the Palestinian people in Gaza, the University Network for Human Rights, the International Human Rights Clinic at Boston University University School of Law, the International Human Rights Clinic at Cornell Law School, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, and the Lowenstein Human Rights Project at Yale Law School have conducted a thorough legal analysis of Israel's acts since October 7th, 2023. And that's just since October 7th, mind you, which is crazy, as situated in their historical context. After reviewing the facts established by independent human rights monitors, journalists, and the United Nations agencies, we conclude that Israel's actions in and regarding Gaza since October 7, 2023, violate the Genocide Convention. Specifically, Israel has committed genocidal acts of killing, causing serious harm to, and inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza, a protected group that forms a substantial part of the Palestinian people. Between October 7, 2023 and May 1st, 2024, Israel has killed at least 34,568 Palestinians, which, yes, that is correct. We'll break into that next segment right after this reading of how clearly that is the case, despite the absurdly obvious to prove their fault line, the obvious lie that they have these numbers. And it says, and injured over 77,000. These figures in total comprise more than 5% of Gaza's population. Which, remember, if you're going to do, respectively, that's like 6.5 million Americans. Think about that for a second. With over 2% of Gaza's children killed or injured. Approximately 14,500 of the Palestinians killed in Gaza have been children, which is also correct. We'll get into the identified versus not identified number. That has not changed. The only ones they can identify, meaning that they were not mutilated to the point where they couldn't recognize or prove who they were. That's what we're actually talking about. And think about how gross it is people use that to act like they were less. Yeah, just like the worst of the worst. But it says Israel killed more children in the first 4 months of this assault. Listen to this. Than in all of the world's conflicts in the past 4 years combined. Israel forces killed more children the first 4 months of this one assault on Gaza, one of many of the past, than in all of the world's conflicts in the past 4 years combined. But according to Israel, they've the most moral army. Nobody has taken the cares they have to avoid killing children. Despite the fact that they've killed more children first 4 months of the assault than all of the world's conflicts in the past 4 years combined. But they did everything they had to. Somehow magically went from doing everything they were supposed to now they need to do more from the U.S. government's perspective, but somehow still doing everything they're supposed to do. I mean, if a lot of these people don't go to prison, I mean, I'm already jaded anyway. I was going to say I don't have any faith in the system. I kind of don't anyway. But my God. This very damn well better be more than just Israeli people in regard to Israeli government. We know everyone in the world around can see that Blinken and Biden and people like Sunak, and I mean, these are people that have been blindly supporting one of the most obvious genocides most people alive have ever seen. And it says, Israel forces have killed Palestinians regardless of their protected status under international law, with the current bombardment constituting the deadliest conflict for journalists ever recorded, and the number of UN personnel killed reaching a degree never seen in history. But again, most moral, doing everything they've needed to do better than any other war you've ever seen before, taking precautions everywhere, but yet they've killed the most journalists, the most UN members, the most children, but the best ever. This is the perverse inversion that I'm talking about of reality. Israel's military operation has destroyed up to 70% of the homes, going on 100. That's what they're trying for. They're going to level this to create what they want to. It is the most obvious part of this. They're literally holding conferences, have money allotted. They are beginning to build settlements already. And that's not occupying. They are already occupying Gaza. This is building settlements on the occupied territory, which is also illegal in its own right. As a it says Israel's military operation has destroyed 70% of homes and has decimated civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, universities, UN facilities, and cultural and religious heritage sites, all under the elusive argument that Hamas was present, despite not having a single example after all they've done. A staggering 1.7 million civilians, over 75% of the Gaza population, have been forcibly displaced. Regardless of the narrative in its own right, that is a massive war crime. And this is as a result of Israel's military offensive. Civilians in Gaza face catastrophic levels of hunger and deprivation due to Israel's restriction on and failure to ensure adequate access to basic essentials of life, including food and water, medicine, and fuel. Now, the main point is the ensuring adequate access. All their narratives about Hamas and this and that, even if everything they ever said was true, it is still their responsibility to make sure that they take care of the people under their occupation. That's the reality, and this is why they try to water it down with the fact that they're not occupied. It's one lie on top of another lie. And this is why it's become so difficult for some to break this all down, because under the one lie is 14 more, but people are seeing through it. And it's the younger generation far more than anybody else. It says Israel's genocidal acts in Gaza have been motivated by the requisite genocidal intent, as evidenced in this report by the statements of Israeli leaders. Most obvious point of all of this, the character of the state and its military forces conduct against and relating to Palestinians in Gaza, and the direct nexus between them. As this report details, officials at all levels of Israeli government, up to and including the prime minister himself, have made remarks that not only express blatant and unequivocal dehumanization and cruelty against Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere, but also explicitly reflect intentions to destroy and exterminate Palestinians as such. That I even have to read that to some people don't know that is shocking. I know you guys likely do. I don't say likely because we may have new people in the chat, but my God, this stuff is the most obvious part of all of it. Openly saying they have no right to be there, that they have no right to exist, that we can destroy them all, level it all, stop everything. And yet they stand up and act like we're misrepresenting them because you're racist. The patterns of conduct of Israeli military forces in Gaza further reinforce the finding of Israel's genocidal intent. Israel's violations of the international legal prohibition of genocide amount to grave breaches of preemptory norms of international law and must cease immediately. These violations also give rise to obligations by all other states. And this is also the important part. I think this was Sam Husseini who was making this point, that it's important to recognize that all the other states that are signed on to the Genocide Convention who are looking the other way, they could find themselves in court. Maybe not to the point of committing genocide, but being complicit with it. I mean, I think we all know that's, at this point, like throughout history, almost equally as important. Because at this point, especially because if the U.S. were to have tried to stop this, they could have on day one. But they didn't care. And I think they never have. And that's the hard reality for many Americans to wrap their mind around. And it doesn't have to be that way, guys. One positive note is that we literally can. We're doing it right now if we just stay the course, look beyond the two-party screamers, the top of the paradigm that want you to keep things the same way. We can change this. We can find a situation where we don't have to rely on people that are inherently dishonest. That's the reality, right? It's not in the way it should be, but it can be, and we can make it that way. Now it says to finish, it says these violations also give rise to obligations by all other states to refrain from recognizing Israel's breaches as legal or taking any actions that may constitute complicity in these breaches, and to take positive steps to suppress, prevent, and punish the commission by Israel of further genocidal acts against Palestinian people in Gaza. The facts in this report are current as of May 1st. So 15 days have passed since then. Between its finalization and publication, reports have already emerged of additional egregious and some of the worst, actually, abuses by Israel against Palestinians in the southern city of Rafah and elsewhere. Jabalia, for example, where more than 1 million Palestinians are seeking refuge in Rafah. These developments, though not reflected in the report, further demonstrate Israel's ongoing genocidal conduct and intent, and underscore the urgency with which the international community must act. Now, you could disregard this as, woke universities, which I'm sure the Republicans that are screaming at the top of the paradigm will want you to think. But I think most conservatives, not Republicans, but people that are, that see this, that recognize the two-party illusion, can also see that this is a problem. And in fact, that it's the same people that were screaming about the COVID shots and the same kind of suppressions and COVID lockdown. These are the same things, guys. The overlap is obvious. Or the fact that as Republicans, as conservatives, you were being censored under the guise that you were anti-Semitic, or that you were racist, or that you were a Nazi 30 seconds ago. Maybe there should be a little bit more understanding there for some of you who don't want to recognize that because of the party paradigm. I think most of you do, though. I really do. Now, let's talk about the numbers. I find this to be very important. I feel like somebody needs to make like an entire study about this. Not just because of the lie, but because of how clearly this demonstrated the broken nature of our entire media apparatus. And really just because of the whole manufacturing consent point, right? A lot of people, I don't even think, recognized how bad they are at this job because they're taught that they're great, because what do? They follow. It's not what journalism is, but they don't know that. Manufacturing consent. They wouldn't be in these positions if they didn't already hold certain beliefs that allow them to think that they were doing what they were told they were supposed to do. It's a very clear manipulation, and sometimes they can see through it. Or there are people in those positions that are there for a reason. to toe certain lines, to hold certain things very like, and you see this overlap, whether we're talking a Zionist infiltration or people in this country that blindly align with that for many different reasons and are willing to openly lie about it and maintain that lie to this moment. Now, I knew that was going to happen. God darn it. So here's the article Robert put out today. The shocking origins of the debunked claim that the UN revised Gaza death toll. Fox News published an article on May 13th, which they have failed to retract, and that ended up going viral on social media, falsely claiming that the United Nations had decreased its recorded Gaza death tolls by around 50%. Now, other claims, which are interestingly overlap, but in their own way, equally dishonest and wrong, excuse me, another group tried to claim that it was just simply revised down by 10,000. I'll show you where both of those lies come from. I guess you could call them misinterpretations, but I find that really hard to believe, as for many reasons we highlight in this article. Now, the two key claims manufactured by the corporate media and then pushed online by pro-Israeli social media personalities are that both the Gaza death tolls and the numbers of women and children in their own equal separate ways have been revised down by the United Nations, and ultimately this implies that the Gaza Health Ministry was lying, or that the UN blindly believed it, or they were part of it. Now, the claim that by the way, there's two things that Robert highlighted in here that I think are really important, showing you where this really stemmed from. Not just that the media blindly pushed it out with nothing but just being handed this, but the people behind it seem to be, interestingly, at least questionable. But you'll see why. The claim that the United Nations had revised its death toll dramatically went viral after Fox published a story entitled UN Revises Death Toll, which they didn't. Almost 50% less women and children killed than a previous reported. Untrue. I'll prove this to you next. On May 10th, at around 6 p.m., a piece was then ran by the New York Sun with a headline reading, United Nations reports lower identified death toll among Palestinian Arabs, noting conflicting numbers from Hamas-run health ministry. Now, this piece was written by none other than M.J. Koch, daughter of Julia Koch, who is known as one of the richest women alive, and of the of course, notorious billionaire Koch family. While the piece falls short of the hyperbolic headlines in later articles contributing to this campaign of disinformation, it does serve as a masterclass in selective quoting and distortion or misreading of statistics. It's hard to know if this was just bad at their job or choosing to lie. But it says the piece, written by M.J. Koch, and you can look at her Twitter feed right there if you'd like, cites two infographics, I'll show you both, released on the website of the United Nations, which, by the way, all comes from Gaza Health Ministry. The numbers we're talking about, by the way, Robert makes this point in the article. Now, here's the point. The first graphic from May 6th, as we'll show you right here, which is what it's looked like up until about the 7th or 8th when it changed, and just really just added more information. Oops. It says, lists the total death as 34,753. That's what we've been seeing. And you can see here that it says reported fatalities, including, and it says 9,500 women, 14,500 children, right? Now, down here, it says this number, this whole graphic number that does not include more than 10,000, which has been that way for a while. So it's probably much more than that. The point is they just don't know, missing or under the rubble. Completely separate from these numbers. And I'll show you why that's important. This is saying that on top of 34,000 that we can confirm, because they have bodies, that there could be 10,000 or more under the rubble somewhere or in other places that we can't see. Then the second graphic, this is May 8th, and this is what they were showing as proof that they were right, and they're not. List the total as 34,844, right? So it went up a little bit because it's 2 days later, showing you they're killing people constantly. But in the breakdown of the casualties, it uses another statistic, which is where Koch begins her misinterpretations. Okay, so you can see here, and here's the actual main pages. This is from May 8th. This one was May, this one's, I'm going to show you in a minute. This is up to yesterday. But here's what it changed to. So 34,844. So I don't even know how you can get confused about the fact that the main number, clearly that didn't change, but there's some people claiming everything's been cut in half. Then it says 24,686 identified as of April 30th and it breaks down the different categories. separate. So so the point is that I've said this already clearly, and I'll play you directly from the UN where they make this clear. It's all this has all been debunked, and people still maintaining it. All they did was add more, differentiate more information, showing you a breakdown. So they're out of 34,844, ends up being like 10,100 and something, which is where this confusion comes in with this number, or choosing to lie, of people that they can't identify, right? So the point is, they're not saying that there's only now this many children compared to the last number. Go back to this to make it more clear. All right, so this number being 14,500 children, and then they go, oh my God, they cut it down to 7,000. No, they didn't. All they're really saying there is that 7,797 children are what they can identify. We know their name. We know where they came from. Here's the family where they're connected to. There is still the remaining amount going up to 14,500, which you'll hear from them directly, of just what we don't identify. And where it gets really disgusting, which means largely that they're so mutilated they can't identify who they are. That's the point here. And yet they decided to hop on this, use the fact that they can't identify mutilated children as a way to downplay the full number. It's just the most detestable, disgusting, inhuman kind of thing we're talking about. So this is where it gets important. And I'm just really listen to this if you want to understand what we're talking about. I don't know why this is confusing to some. I guess it's just kind of a statistical breakdown. To me, it's very simple. And then I'll get into this 10,000 part again, because what they did here is they basically said, it's the same number from up here. That's a separate and in addition to the number. And what they did is they then confused or intentionally misrepresented that is the 10,000. So they're going, oh, I see what they did. They just admitted that there was 10,000. They don't even know if it exists. It's just, we're guessing. It might be out there somewhere. And that they claimed that's not what the case is. And you'll hear it directly from the UN. Not that you need to. I think it's pretty obvious. And remember, guys, as we're breaking this obvious reality down, I'll show you some of them. There are major media personalities, major Israeli representatives who are tripling down on this lie right now, right in this moment. Even though I have posted what the UN said, or other people have posted what the Haaretz wrote about it, saying this was fake, and still they push because it's desperate propaganda, reactive. In the May 8th infographic that I just showed you, its breakdown of casualties is based upon the April 30th statistic, which says right there, just based up as of April 30th, so it's going to go up. That 24,686 Palestinians who have been identified after being discovered versus the 10,158 who had not yet been identified, which includes women and children. The confirmed body count is unfortunately the same. Unfortunately, just because it's too many people that have been killed. Now, the United Nations clearly states right above those statistics that the death toll is in fact 34,844. So the first idea that the whole thing has been halved is ludicrously obvious. But then it says the one thing that changed is that between May 6th and the 8th, another distinction within the total was made, namely whether the bodies were able to be identified or not, which sadly implies in some cases that they were too mutilated to make an identification. Yet the physical body is in their possession, and the death is still confirmed at least by the Gaza Health Ministry. The graphic also states below that this total does not include an estimated 10,000 or more buried under the rubble, which, if added, would actually bring the total to 44,844 or more. So there's that. I hope that makes that very clear about how they're playing that. But it says, while Koch's article misinterprets or misrepresents these stats to argue there are contradicting death tolls, claiming the number of Palestinians killed is lower than what the Gaza Health Ministry says, she also fails to bring up the fact that, interestingly enough, which I think should be self-evident, the 24,686 number of those that are actually identified also comes from the Gaza Health Ministry. So think about how dumb it is to make an argument that you all got caught lying. Here's the right number. But that's Gaza Health Ministry. So if you're pretending they're lying, why is that one? Because it's about trying to frame it in a way that confuses people, guys, probably just for a moment as this all falls apart. So we don't pay attention that they just murdered a UN member, an international staff member, or they just bombed a million more. I mean, it's just constant. It's about deviation, sidestep, or, winning over opinion in small ways. This key piece of information alone, that the numbers still come from them, which is, by the way, absent from the New York Sun piece. I think most of them try to present it as if this is a UN presented number. as if they came to that conclusion. It's not. They just are. It's like all the rest of them. The only group they can cite is the Gaza Health Ministry, and I'll show you why they continue to. But the point is the fact that they use that and don't highlight that that's where it came from while claiming that that's why you're all being lied to instantly debunks the arguments being constructed in the piece. I completely agree with that. Now remember, not because Vice said it, but the point is Vice is highlighting that Israeli intelligence on January 25th of this year openly stated that the death toll figures were generally accurate. Now, of course, they could be lying. But isn't it hilarious that the very people, like all the Mike Rappaports of the world, will come out and say, you got caught lying? Well, okay, well then are you going to address the fact that your own government lied about this for some reason? The truth is they weren't lying. It's always been this case, and you can look back to the UN and go back years. They've always pretty much been accurate. And this one is a Hebrew article saying the Army also checked. So intelligence says, yes, accurate. The Army, the IDF, checked and said, yeah, they're generally reliable on January 24th. How ridiculous is that? So it goes on to say, some 3.5 hours later, after the Koch piece, an article was then produced by the Times of Israel, in which it argued that the UN has revised its women and children death tolls to reflect a 17% decrease. All they're doing is highlighting the number that looked lower and manipulating that by pretending that's what the new number is, even though that was just a differentiation between identified and not identified. And it says, which is false, obviously. They lied about that. I think they know that. It cites the two exact same infographics we just showed you, the same ones that MJ Koch used in her piece. But interestingly, and I do think this is relevant without citing her article, even though that's where most of this came from. The following is the crux of the argument. Well, they just highlight what he just wrote. The fact that they're pointing to that number and acting like that's the new number. It's not. It's easy to prove. This argument acknowledges that the UN website lists the total as 34,000 while completely ignoring that the children and women list as killed are from the 24,000 figure of simply those that they're able to identify. It wasn't until May 13th, however, that when Fox News published their piece on the issue that the story really went viral, and that's how that works, and would give birth to the separate claim that the 10,000 less deaths were alleged by the UN website, which also wasn't true. Fox News article would make the claim that the UN had lowered both the women and children death tolls in Gaza by 50%. All these, what's hilarious is they all have their own different incorrect statistics and numbers, none of which are true. But it goes, and again, cited the exact same misrepresentations by those graphics. Now, what is interesting here, he writes, is that despite the Times of Israel and the New York Sun both having cited the two exact same infographics in order to premise their separate arguments, equally false, about the UN's alleged changes to the death toll, Fox News cited neither of those. So now you've got three different outlets and groups pointing to the same things, forming separately and equally false conclusions that all lean in the same direction that you shouldn't trust Gaza Health Ministry. The fact that none of these three articles bothered citing each other could in and of itself be telling, as all of them use the exact same infographics. And as he writes in the bottom, which I don't think I get into, the point is that how is it possible that you tell me the writers may have missed it? Sure. I don't believe they're even that good at their jobs, but the editors, everybody else involved, no one was able to note. Of course they were able to see. Of course they saw the Fox or the Times of Israel, the New York Sun. Of course they saw these articles. So they just not only concluded something equally false, but different in the same direction. They didn't even cite the art. I mean, there's clearly something coordinated happening there. That's my opinion. Another important fact to point out is that the woman who wrote the Fox News article is a British Israeli named Ruth Marks English, who had previously worked for the Jerusalem Post for 15 years. After becoming an Israel-based correspondent for the Washington Post, she also accompanied Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, quote, on several times on high-level trips to Washington and to Africa. English also moved to the United States in 2020 in order to, quote, assist Israel's ambassador to the United States and the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, with his English language media outreach. The ambassador to the United States, right? And it says, in addition to working with American journalists, she says, I advised the ambassador on a broad range of current affairs and communications matters, helped prepare him for American media interviews, wrote his op-eds. I don't think you're supposed to say that out loud. Speeches and social media posts. This is on her LinkedIn page, by the way. Now, the Fox News piece was then boosted by the New York Post. So all this time building, Times of Israel, New York Sun, Fox pushes it out, right? And the point is that Mrs. New York Post then gives it its final big push that republished the article on their website. All of these major platforms didn't either chose to post something they knew was false for a clear propaganda purpose, which, Smith-Mott Modernization Act, who knows, that's certainly possible, or are just that bad at their jobs and don't even care as long as it leans in a certain direction, which I think most people are easy. It's easy for most people to wrap their mind around that. But it says, but decided to give it an even more outrageous headline. This is literally what the New York Post framed this as. UN admits Gaza death toll wrong with almost 50% fewer women, children killed than previous reported. Admits? That's crazy. Because they're literally standing up saying that's not true right now, and I'll play it for you. But this means that they, again, lied or this bad at being a journalist or an editor. This ended up stirring up a debate online with pro-Israeli social media accounts using these articles on which to premise their arguments that the death toll in Gaza was lower. With the United Nations, but it says that the United Nations was lying and that the Gaza Health Ministry is a Hamas propaganda operation. The false allegations about the UN changing its figures spread like wildfire. Take for example, of the CBC, Canadian State Media, which they entitled their article, Why the UN Changed Its Death Toll of Palestinian Women and Children Killed in Gaza. So now we got Canadian media, corporate media, CBC, Fox News, CNN. I mean, it's everybody. Actually, in fact, CNN, weirdly enough, didn't call it right. Hate even saying that out loud, but it's true. The CBC piece begins by stating that the United Nations, quote, is facing scrutiny after lowering its counts of Palestinian women. Not true. Which gives the sense that not only was the allegation proven true, but that there was some kind of legitimate fury over this. None of that was true. At this point, the UN had not yet responded. But after massive media stir, the United Nations finally commented on this. And here's what the important one that I found in regard to him addressing this directly. Now, there was, interestingly enough, a couple of examples before this, which I personally, my opinion, feel were intentionally manipulated. My point being, there was one guy that I saw just before this. He was kind of like touching his face in a weird way. That might help you remember who I was talking about. I don't know who it was. But he asked, now looking back at it, after seeing this statement, which you'll see, and reading the information and knowing absolute certainty that they lied about this, that you can look at what he says now and go, okay, I see what he was doing. In a very opaque way, asking very specifically broad questions to get him to say things that made it sound like everything had changed. Didn't happen. His point was ultimately that there, all of this is like at the end of the day, these are estimates. But whether it's under the rubble or whether it's the fact that we don't know if Gaza Health Ministry could be wrong, the point is these things are always evolving. Doesn't mean that it's all false. Historically, it's always been pretty accurate. And to this very point, there has continually been shown to be correct. And on top of that, they just got caught lying about this entire story. My point is that they did it in a way to make it seem before this really broke that they were already caught lying or that was the truth story. Plenty of these propagandists online have been just standing with that. Now, here's what he just said. This is recent. As of what I said this on May 14th. UN spokesman debunks the lie about the Gaza death toll being halved. This easily verifiable lie went viral due to countless influential corporate, quote, journalists and nearly every major Israeli supporter either lying or failing to do basic due diligence.
Thanks, Farhan. There's some reporting that's come out that says, quote, the UN has halved the number of casualties.
Halved, yes. It's a hard word to say.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about, though,
yes,
right?
I do know. Cut in half.
Cut in half, thank you. The casualties from Gaza, is that true?
It's not quite the case, no. What I can tell you is this. The overall number of fatalities that's been tallied by the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which is our counterpart on dealing with the death tolls, that number remains unchanged, and it's at more than 35,000 people since October 7th.
So that's the first claim. Now, that has already been kind of walked back by most of these people, where even though in the beginning they were clearly saying, oh, they halved all the numbers. That was what kind of became the talking point on all the Twitter screamers. Then it became clear that that was a lie. Most of the ones that don't want to admit they dive to the next one. That's how that tends to work with Israeli propaganda. And because I didn't say all of it, I just meant the women and children, which is also not true. But just to be clear, that's what your people are saying. It's obvious that number hasn't changed.
What's changed is the Ministry of Health in Gaza has updated the breakdown of fatalities for whom full details have been documented. Meaning
their name, their location, their family, not that they don't have a body.
So what they recently published was that They gave figures for 24,686 out of 34,622 overall fatalities recorded in Gaza.
Very clear.
And those 24,686 people are the ones for whom full details have been documented.
Full details. Now, Robert made a point about this just in our personal conversations about apparently there's a whole level of details that they consider to be what you then that person's now identified. And until they get all of them, that they're considered not identified. But the body is there. As I said, the body is in their possession. They dig these bodies out of the rubble and they're mutilated and they don't know how to find out who they are. It still goes down as a casualty. They just can't prove it. Now, up until May 6th, they hadn't been giving that information. They just decided to give you the breakdown so we understood that a lot of them have yet to even be identified. It's just good information to break it down. And instead, it got misrepresented by a bunch of very devious people.
In other words, people who have been fully identified. Out of that smaller number, that subset of identified bodies, you have 7,797 children.
Of just that subset. I mean, I hope this is as clear as it can get. The point is that there is the remainder of that in the other side that have yet to be identified.
4,959 women, 1,924 elderly, and 10,006 men. And the Ministry of Health says that the documentation process of fully identifying details of the casualties is ongoing.
Right.
Meanwhile, as you can see if you do the math, that there's about another 10,000 plus bodies who still have to be fully identified. And so then the detail.
So right there is about the other ones that need to be identified, not the 10,000 we on top of all that, which he mentions too, are in addition to that full number, 34,000, that might still be under the rubble. The fact that those numbers are so close is what they pounced on.
Of those, which of those are children, which of those are women, that will be reestablished once the full identification process is complete.
And I just have to reiterate how disgusting that is. The fact that they're having trouble identifying whether or not they're children, just let that sink in. This is one of the most obvious atrocities. You can quibble about the word genocide all you want, even though it's verifiably clear. That the fact that they're doing this to innocent people, whatever the narrative, this is why most people are not okay with this, even if they support Israel.
Our teams in Gaza are unable to independently verify these figures, given the situation on the ground and the continuing combat and the sheer number of fatalities. And so,
which in the argument being, it's most likely a hell of a lot more, but you could argue it might be a little bit less. The point is, it's an ongoing situation. Nobody's argued that they're guaranteeing exactly. The point is that this is and historically has been accurate. So there's no better, and Israel itself has said they're both accurate and reliable, and now it's even being shown that they've been trying to lie about it in general. It's pretty clear these are accurate numbers.
We cite the Ministry of Health as the source for our figures.
And do you have any reason to believe that the Ministry of Health numbers are incorrect based on the years that the UN has worked with the Ministry of Health of Gaza?
Unfortunately, we have the sad experience of coordinating with the Ministry of Health on casualty figures every few years.
Meaning just his point there to kind of subtly point out, unfortunately, they get attacked every few years with lots of casualties. Who do you think's doing that? It's Israel.
For large mass casualty incidents in Gaza. And in past times, their figures have proven to be generally accurate.
Yep. Exactly what anybody honest will tell you. That's the reality. So back to the article. As he writes, there is simply no question that the claims made regarding the UN revising its Gaza death toll in any way are false. Yet despite this, these news outlets have not retracted their various pieces and even bothered to amend them or even apologize. Now, to me, that shows you this was propaganda and there's something else driving this. Under normal circumstances, it could be plausibly argued that a genuine mistake was made, right, in the interpretation of this. And when you break down, as I said before, the editors, the different people, the multiple articles, the time frame, I agree, it's impossible. It's at every level. Somebody in there might have, but at every level, there's no way, in my opinion. What is truly worrying is that such a large number of media outlets, online pundits, and social media influencers took these claims at face value, didn't even care to do their due diligence, or they know they were lying and they pushed it anyway. Many of them standing by these allegations to this very moment, when debunking the allegations was as easy as simply clicking on the links and reading the infographic. What's funny about that is many of them, as I said, We're giving you the link to the infographic that proved that they were wrong. I didn't care. Or I should say, sorry, I was checking something, but they either didn't care or didn't know. And that's what's so embarrassing for some of them, which I've already seen some delete their tweets because they're quietly trying to back like Homer Simpson into the bushes. Like, oops, I'm showing them that I am really bad at this, or that I don't care, or that I don't even understand what this job is. But it says, these are not complex infographics either. Very simple, very easy to read. It even puts the damn things in bold. As he writes, where was it? These are not complex. The key points are clear, color-coded, even written in bold, so that even a child could comprehend them. It appears as if the goal was to create an artificially manufactured media stir about the official Gaza death toll. And again, whether it's distracting from something else, like this conversation we covered here about Israel killing international UN member, first one of being an international staff member that wasn't part of, Gaza, Palestinian or something. And I think that got immediately washed away by this, and this one we'll get to, by immediately going, look, Hamas works with them, as if we should then somehow mean that doesn't matter that you killed the person from wherever country they were from. There's an international member of UN. That's how this works. It works for some people. As long as you can point out something else that you should be outraged about, you don't have to care about the crime they just committed, even though that's also fake, and we'll get to it in a second. But it says just then one day later, the Israeli government, of course, after this whole thing happened, as if this wasn't completely coordinated, decided to publish, because they just woke up one day and said, here's a good time, their own death statistics. Taking this whole time, and here's the best point. You remember this clip. I mean, we're not too long. Maybe it's a good point to play this. I know you guys have probably seen this. This is a really good clip. And I hate having to shout out Piers Morgan, because I don't think he's an honest person, but it's a great clip. And what he did here really did highlight something that I think put them on their back foot for a very clear reason. Now, the point is, this guy in this interview was put on the spot and came out and made it. And Piers Morgan and the conversation made it very clear by default that they didn't know or didn't care how many civilians they were killing. That happened just before this. Now, interestingly enough, all of a sudden, when people are going, oh man, this guy clearly doesn't know, that means they probably are killing a lot of people. All of a sudden, this huge push comes out to make it look like Gaza was lied, or they're all being lied to. The numbers are small, and they're not really killing anybody. And then, after this push comes out, and this has been done, after this guy gets embarrassed and they make this fake story, they just randomly decide to post their own numbers. And guess what? They've only killed 16,000 civilians. As if that's somehow better. Think about how crazy that is. So you're now publishing that you've killed 16,000 civilians? When I haven't seen a single provable example of a Hamas member you've killed, even though I'm sure it's impossible that you haven't. But then the point is, that's not true. This is the same story. This is like saying, oops, we just killed our own people, accident, when more likely you murdered them for Hannibal Directive. And so the point is, you come out with the story to circumvent, to get ahead of it. No, it was only 16,000. Well, yeah, those are war crimes. You might go to jail for that, but at least it's not 34,000. At least it's not. I think that's what's happening. I think this is desperate. In any case, it came out right after they produced this manufactured push. And Fox News dutifully did their job as a propagandist. Israel releases new Gaza civilian death toll, says Hamas's numbers are fake and fabricated. But he finishes by saying, why would Israel feel the need to do this now? It is likely that following a viral exchange between British TV's host Piers Morgan and Israel spokesman Avi Hayam, the Israeli government felt the need to act. During the interview, as you'll see, he repeatedly asks about the number of civilians killed in Gaza, to which the representative has no response, but to claim that UN's figures are wrong and that they come from Hamas. So you see why this is needed all of a sudden. The Israeli spokesman comes off looking guilty, and it became clear that if any other Israeli spokesman was pressed on this very question, that they would be trapped. So this is why you can see the reactive propaganda. And I think they jumped on a moment where they saw the UN update something and they said, perfect, let's make that a minute. That's what I think. Israel is ramping up its attacks in Gaza and is on the cusp of a major invasion of Rafah. After blocking all the crossing, they've created a situation where, it's very clear this is about to happen. This campaign that I think, and as Robert writes, was designed to belittle the suffering of the Gaza Strip, as these operations only seem to increase. This entire facade should go down in history as an example of how the media helped aid Israel in committing a genocide, and as one of the clearest examples to date of either a shocking level of corporate media incompetence or a scandalous level of complicity, possibly both. Here's the interview that I think really did spur this whole thing on.
I have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
It's not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense. Why are you authorized to give me the number of terrorists you've killed, but not the number of civilians? I don't understand. Can you explain?
That's a real pause right there.
Piers, we will go after Hamas. We'll do what we have to do.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have grabbed, I just grabbed one I found real quick on Twitter. Somebody edited all this around. I thought it was good with subtitles, so I guess somebody edited this. I apologize. You saw it on the last show. We played it directly from the clip that was on there. And I'll let it play out, though, so you can get the gist of it, but I hate that people add their own stuff to this. It was good the way it was.
To go after Hamas, to avoid civilian casualties, something that we have successfully done. Out of that Hamas number that you just gave, more than 14,000 are terrorists that we took out. There's more than 25,000 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists.
How many civilians do you believe you've killed?
We don't have exact figures, as you know. It's the fog of war.
But you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists. And
hang on, I mean, that does imply that you're putting a bigger premium on killing Hamas terrorists in terms of numbers and accountability than you are on innocent civilians. That can't be right, surely.
Now, the point, though, is that right there is where in the past, most journalists, and even right now, many of them, would have taken that and moved forward. Even though there's an obvious journalistic gap right there, which he pounced on. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Logically, you just admitted that you don't care about civilians. And he's right. Just remember that for 75 years, really, it wasn't immediate, but, let's say for 40, 50 years, you've seen this overwhelmingly obvious control over this kind of situation where people would either, because they're afraid to be called racist or any number of things, would have just let it go. Thank God it's not happening anymore.
You know exactly how many Hamas terrorists you've killed. You must know how many civilians you've killed. Otherwise, you're prioritizing the lives of terrorists over innocent people.
Piers, with respect, don't put words into my mouth, please. I didn't say exactly 14,000. I said around 14,000, whereas Hamas will come out with precise numbers that statisticians will look at.
Give me a ballpark number for civilians.
Well, you can use the ballpark as far as the Hamas figures, which I reject as being false.
Well, if they're false, why would you give me those?
I gave you the numbers that I had.
No, you told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't seem to have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
Are you bemused, are you? How about horrified, disgusted? You're heard about human lie, but bemused. But the point is that he even tried to say in there that, well, the statisticians have looked at and they don't even make sense. Like, how do you make that statement when the army and your intelligence have already claimed they're reliable? It's just because it doesn't matter. It's about immediate gratification or immediate benefit. Lie, get this moment, win this thing, and then doesn't matter if we just stepped on 14 other lies. It's crazy. I say desperate because I think that's what it is, but it could be something else driving this, but it's crazy. Maybe they're just that bad at it. I don't know. Wild.
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
No, hang on. I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed. I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
Because even if you were to go by a ratio of the Hamas figures, we would still be far ahead of any Western army.
That wasn't my question. It wasn't my question.
I don't have the information.
You literally have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
It's not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense. Why are you authorized to give me the number of terrorists you've killed, but not the number of civilians? I don't understand.
Yeah, you do. Real pause.
Can you explain?
That's crazy.
Piers, we will go after Hamas. We will ensure that we
But you want me to
return
believe you're being incredibly careful about how many civilians you're killing, and you have an amazing exemplary record, but you don't know how many civilians you're killing.
Now, just so you know, I'm going to end it there. This is only halfway through the clip. It's only halfway. It goes on exactly like this for the rest of the story, where he keeps harping on that point. And good for him, because that's what you should do. The guy doesn't have an answer, and all he's going to do is push back and say, I'm not allowed to, I'm not authorized to. And so it really does show you, at the very least, if you want to take him at face value, that he's being told he's not supposed to tell you. What does that tell you? And no matter which way you read into this, it's clear that this worked out terribly for their propaganda. And that's where this all came from. I think Robert nailed this. It's exactly what happened. And they come out immediately after this big false push and to publish their own numbers. And then Fox dutifully follows suit. I mean, come on. This is, and here, just to go forward, actually, I'll do this last, or just at least after this. Remember, this is Haaretz. This is from 2 days ago. The UN says overall death count in Gaza remains unchanged after revising source of data. Revising, meaning that they literally added more information. Here, a breakdown from France 24. Did the UN revise down its numbers? No. Shocking. Surprise, surprise. Fact check. No, they didn't. It's being lied about everywhere. I guess I'll do this at the end then. I want to point one quick thing out about the food aid point down there. But just let's remember the people we're talking about here. Here's a famous Zionist manipulator, David Collier. And he goes, becoming clearer by the day. Sky News lied for 7 months sharing Hamas propaganda. It's all stemming from the same push. He's been harping on this. BBC News, which I don't support any of these ridiculous propaganda platforms, but BBC lied for 7 months using Hamas propaganda. CNN lied for 7 months. He's basing this on this big propaganda push when all they did was point to the Gaza Health Ministry numbers, and they're accurate. And even his own Israeli, specifically Army and intelligence, have said the same. Here, Jeffrey Mead, he's I forget who this was again. Just a guy who's in this conversation. It seems to be constantly shilling for Zionism. He says the UN revised its number count by almost 50%. So think about this. This guy reads this headline, takes a screenshot, and then just ignorantly vomits this out on Twitter. That's what a lot of people do. And he's wrong. And I highlighted that. I said, you're either demonstrating a shocking lack of due diligence or a shocking level of dishonesty. And here is the UN. No, this is person saying with the receipts. Here is James J. Marlowe. Not familiar with the word, but he is a foreign and defense analyst and broadcast journalist with focus on Israel. Shocking for GB News, LBC. So a journalist and a foreign and defense analyst, and yet he blindly says they've halved their numbers. These are people that are withstanding, people that have major positions of whether they're journalism or in government, and they are either this dishonest or are this inept. It is kind of scary. I did the same thing. Here's another one. This is just a Israeli Jew, and he's saying the protocols warned you about. Just really trying to harp on you. You're all racist, and then you're like he's trying to lean into the thing that people protocols of Zionism or Zion. And the idea that he's trying to, my point is, I think a lot of these people are either victims of, in a mental state constantly, not to say that there's not racism or anti-Semitism, but the idea that everyone's out to get them because they believe the Zionist propaganda, or they're part of keeping that illusion going. That's my personal opinion. But he says, so the UN just quietly erased half the women. First of all, quietly, hardly. It was a major discussion, and they screamed about how, in regard to the propaganda around it, but they also didn't have any of that. It's just, and again, I said the same thing. Let's see what he said. Oh, see, thanks, Twitter. So apparently somebody responded, but I'm not allowed to see it. Good job, Twitter. Now, here's the important part as well. I found this to be very telling. Mr. Elon Levy, somebody who is clearly a propagandist. So he didn't say anything about this. I looked through his posts, unless he deleted them, which is very likely. He didn't post, and you would expect someone like this to pounce on this, to scream about, I knew it, I told you, but he didn't. He was very, very reserved, and yet, though, he quietly boosted a lot of the bigger posts that said the same lie. Another blatant lie, Israel's exposed. Really? Here he is again, tweeting this one out. One more critical comment about this revision, and posting the one I just showed you. This is what he's doing. These guys are liars, patent liars, provable liars, people that know they're lying to you.
Let me
Let me preface these remarks with I never, ever believe Israeli figures. I've been in the government too long to know that the Israelis are patent liars.
Now, remember, the 13th of May is when they killed a international UN staff member, which is the first one they've killed, which should have gotten a lot of attention, except they immediately shoved the conversation into all of this. That's important. Now, one other quick point before we get into the other thing I think they manufactured the same day to make this all happen. It's the 14th, by the way. I truly believe all they did was take a picture of some policemen next to the UN cars and scream that they were terrorists, and everybody picked it up that didn't care about the truth. Before we get to that, though, here's another great article Robert wrote from the 15th. Fox News produces Iran nuclear weapons hoax scare. Now, we've talked about this a lot. The JCPOA, the idea of your enriched uranium and the lies that were spun around the whole thing. The bottom line, if you don't remember that, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, the point, whatever your thoughts on it, whether you agree with it or not, the point was that it was a deal created in good faith by the U.S. and just whatever you believe. The point is that you create a deal. The argument is in good faith that you're going to honor that deal, not just through one presidency. The point is that they made this agreement. And the agreement stated unequivocally, and in two separate points, I think it was 26 and 38, if I remember correctly, off the top of my head, of these different points of the deal, which I've gone through extensively. And I link in this discussion, by the way, that the point was that if any party, explicitly the United States, pulled out of the deal unilaterally, that gave them the ability to increase their enriched uranium legally and within the deal to a certain amount, which is what they did. And the moment that started, the group that pretended they didn't want to be part of the deal started saying, you're breaking the deal. You know, the deal that Trump pulled out of, right? Even though they weren't breaking the deal, they were acting legally within the deal because they pulled out. And they knew this, guys. It's the same thing as the numbers at the UN. They're playing on the ignorance of the average people, knowing that you don't know the finer points of the JCPOA. So that point aside, the point is they've lied about this forever. They've lied about Iran. They've said every year for the last 40 years that they were 30 seconds away from a nuclear bomb. And over and over and over, the International Atomic Energy Agency have come out and said that's not true. Even the United States government, I think it was a year ago, I forget exact time, I just showed it to you recently, came out and said they are not seeking a nuclear weapon. Both the IAEA and the U.S. government. So, and here we are back again, where guess what? Fox News pushes out another, and they're just as bad as CNN and the rest. It's all just a teeter-totter. My point is that what this ultimately comes to, and it's another one of these, Iranian lawmaker declares they've obtained a bomb. That's not what happened. You read it for yourself. It's just like the other story. The bottom line is it is a newly elected member of parliament who does no security access, who has no insight to what's actually going on with the nuclear program, who simply said, not that he knows this or declares anything, but that he believes, based on a couple of opaque statements, that don't say we're doing it, but say that we might have to change our posture based on what the U.S. is doing, which could mean a lot of things. And maybe it does mean they're going to do this. But the point is that he said on the record that he believes, based on this and based on the changing dynamics, that they probably do. And on top of that, guess where that information comes from? It comes from an egregiously obvious anti-Iranian platform called the Iran International, which is a U.S. CIA, my opinion, it is an intelligence cutout that it's used to lie about Iran. You can read all this for yourself. The bottom line is it's not even remotely that Iran lawmaker declares they've obtained a bomb, which is what shot through all of it, which people like Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham used to scream about Iran. We are lost in this complete manipulation right now, guys. And so many people in this country fall for these things because they believe that the people in these outlets care about you. They don't. Now, on to this point. Kogat, which I've shown you 45 times, is a complete propaganda platform that doesn't do, all they seem to do is lie about what's going on in Gaza, at least right now. So they came out and said on the 14th that what were terrorists doing inside of the UNRWA logistic compound? Well, all you're going to see are people with guns. That's it. You can watch the whole damn thing. You've got guns next to people in the UN. That's all you got. Okay? And so you can watch the whole thing for yourself. It's only 49 seconds. So you could certainly argue Hamas members, but don't we care about evidence? Doesn't it matter? Because you realize there's a lot more people with guns than just Hamas in this location. It could be even other than Hamas, right? Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And here's the other part I want to point out too. Now, all you're seeing is just action. I don't see any shooting. I don't see any killing. My point though is that one thing I do want to point out is that from right here, it's a different video. So you got UN, even this one's different. So 3 separate locations. You got UN cars with people there. Then you got a random guy outside of a UN building, which doesn't then necessarily mean that they're working with the UN or even part of what's going on there. And then it goes to a completely separate location, which for all I can tell has nothing to do with any things they showed. And that's the one that seems to be more suggestive of something other than just being there on guard. But how do we even know they're connected? They've been caught lying every time they put stuff like this out. So here's the main point. At the end of the day, it's very clear that these are, and it's been statements put out, policemen. As we've shown you before, where they use an image of a policeman, even wearing the police uniform, literally says police on his uniform, and they go, Hamas with the aid, because they think people are stupid. The IDF points it out. Same thing. Caught on terrorists roaming, shooting at the compound. What? The point is, Favaz points out, this is another example of Israeli propaganda to legitimize the killing of UN workers, humanitarian workers, and journalists. Now, they are propagandizing these videos to justify the killing of an Indian, so it's an Indian, by the way, UN employee who was just killed by Israel. Same video. Here's Mohammed pointing out, this is a security guard for aid distribution. UNRWA has security guards that protect them from thieves and gangs in order to distribute the aid, which, by the way, they keep shooting anyway. Yanis Tarawi points out, oh my Allah, Palestinian civilian police is working with UNRWA in undercover clothes to evacuate their logistics center. Why undercover? Because Israel systematically murders them. What an unusual incident. Guys, this is the most obvious reality of all of this. They're shooting every example they can find of these people. And you know why we know that? Because even the United States government spoke up and said, hey, can you stop shooting the police officers? Which is kind of shocking to me. This is from Times of Israel. U.S. said to ask Israel to stop targeting Hamas police officers escorting aid convoys in Gaza. Yeah, it's almost always that simple right now, guys. The bottom line is they are simply highlighting the people that they keep trying to tell you are Hamas, which, by the way, they're telling you everybody's Hamas. They're telling you the UN is Hamas. They're telling you that the police are Hamas. They're telling you that individual Palestinians are Hamas. That baby in the incubator, that's Hamas. That's what they're doing. So it kind of adds doubt, it should, to the claim that everything is Hamas all the time. But here is a U.S. representative blatantly lying to you in 2 ways. First, he says UNRWA employees took part on October 7th. He just says that as an absolute fact, even though the United States and the UK have come out and said, no, you haven't provided that evidence. This is from the end of last month. This is less than a couple of weeks ago. Here is Canada. Israel still hasn't provided evidence to back up the claims that UNRWA was linked to Gaza or October 7th. Here is from the UN. Israel yet to provide evidence to back up the claims that they're part of it's the same damn thing. Here's the Cologne report. Israel gave no evidence that they're linked to terrorism. And here's Human Rights Watch. Israel is attacking known aid worker locations. Yet here's a U.S. And by the way, there are Americans, both hostages as well as Palestinians, that are in Gaza. And here's an American representative. I shouldn't even call him that because he doesn't represent anything American or Americans, allowing this to happen. But then he says, now we've got video that Hamas is using as cover UN vehicles. This guy is I don't even know a word strong enough. He is actively creating the justification to commit genocide, right? He's manipulating American perception to believe wholesale lies. He starts with one that his own government has said is not proven. This guy's working for somebody other than Americans, period. I don't think that's hard to recognize. Here's Elon Levy, adding another ridiculous claim. The IDF targeted a Hamas war room and weapons storage facility, and you'll never believe where it was. Guess what? The timing. An UNRWA school. Oh, you know how they can prove that? Here's an image we concocted on our computer. Oh, weird. There's no video. There's no source material. It's just a random image of a square, of which, by the way, you have got caught lying about every time, as far as I can tell. Al-Shifa, even the BBC, and what was it? I think it might have been France 24 as well, broke it down and said, here's how they were lying. Here's how they've circled the wrong location. And this is the IDF coming. This is directly from their highest authority. So they're literally sitting in rooms going, how do we lie about this today? It's shocking. Here's Francesca Albanese highlighting another manipulation that I think is very important. Israel's use of the IHL jargon, warnings, evacuation orders, safe zones, that we drop leaflets and we're the most moral army to get civilians out of the way, is to create the illusion that its military operations ensure protection of civilians. This is the UN rapporteur. And specifically, what was it again? Anyway, she goes on to say, this humanitarian camouflage, good way to put it, has de facto turned Gaza into a place without civilians, where everything is destroyable and everyone is killable, which, by the way, that's what anybody honest has been saying from day one. You created the categories that they're either Hamas, human shields, or voted for them. So either way you look at it, they're all somewhat guilty, which is exactly what they're all pushing. Forensic Architecture, who you should follow, has done some great work on this so far in multiple different topics. And Israeli forces advance into Rafah's densely populated center, bombing indiscriminately and targeting what little aid medical infrastructure remains in Gaza. They are forcing the 1.5 million civilians in Rafah into a humanitarian zone, in quotes, with no functioning medical infrastructure. They're guaranteeing they're going to die slowly and terribly in a location which they can't. That's assuming they don't get bombed and shot on the way or while they're there. It says, yet again, Israel's use of evacuation orders and designation of humanitarian zones are performative acts that, in fact, endanger rather than protect civilian life. We have been documenting the Israeli weaponization of humanitarian measures since October. It's amazing what the supposed rules-based international order can ignore. As part of the ongoing incursion into Rafah, the Israeli military has closed all remaining points of entry for aid into Gaza. Oh, and I'm glad I remembered that. And that's a good place to point out anyway. So this is the newest one as of yesterday from the OCHA, from the United Nations. Remember how Elon, he's weirdly and clearly why, I know why, trailed off with this push about the aid, which now that I say this, watch him kick back into gear tomorrow with Kogat about how they've got more food than they've ever had in their lifetimes, despite the fact that you can prove that's not true with this entire breakdown. But check out the last weeks. Look at this. Just again, in case you don't remember, 500 truckloads, including fuel, before October 7th, and they were still dangerously food insecure. That has never been surpassed once. The blue you're looking at is the daily average. So if they did 500 trucks before and it was food insecure at that point, they guaranteed a slow starvation and famine by doing this. That was the plan. Now look at this. May 10th, 0. May 11th, 6. And I guarantee you that didn't come from anything Israeli related, probably around them in whatever way, from doctors and whoever else. May 12th to the 15th, 0. That is day after day after day of literally nothing while they are in famine. How else do you describe that? That's deliberate collective punishment, starvation, genocide. No way around it. And let's realize, by the way, on October 20th, I showed this so many times, Amnesty International looked just between the 7th and 12th of October, on October 20th, just those few days. And on October 20th, 2023, they already deemed that they were murdering civilians without any due diligence. In the sense meaning they weren't telling them they were coming. There was multiple examples that they were targeting them directly, murdering them because they were trying to. In some cases, they said they were not taking appropriate precautions or just in general, just indiscriminately bombing. All of which was proven. Damning evidence of war crimes as Israeli attacks wipe out entire families. October 20th. And yet, here we are, 7 months later. Lastly, I'll finish with some of these I think it's important to see. Decentered News. Report by Channel 4 News, so mainstream Israeli media, on the murder of a disabled Palestinian with learning difficulties. It's so many of these, it's every one of them matter. But it's sad how they blend into the background because these individual examples are so effing common daily and long before October 7th, as far back as you want to look. I'll just play an opening part of this.
The incident lasts just 20 seconds, but it tells a tragically familiar story of life and death in the West Bank. A young Palestinian man is seen throwing stones towards what appear to be Israeli soldiers. Seconds later, the man falls to the ground, motionless. 27-year-old Fuad Abu Sabah, a disabled man from the town of Yatta in Hebron, was killed by a single bullet through his neck. A man born with medical complications whose family fought desperately to keep him alive, only to lose him in an instant. another death in a seemingly endless conflict. But this particular tragedy was one that we'd already stumbled across, although we didn't realize it at the time. On October the 30th, our team set out from our hotel for Hebron in the south of the occupied West Bank. Also films the mosque and the Israeli watchtower and others who feel forced off their ancestral lands by armed Israeli settlers. After several hours, we returned to the same checkpoint. Just before we arrive at 11:42:10, security footage shows Fuad throwing a stone toward what appear to be Israeli troops. The timestamp on the CCTV reads 12 because the clocks went back by an hour that weekend and had not yet been updated. 32 seconds later, he throws another stone. Then one of the men in fatigues crouches down. At 11:43 exactly, Fuad is shot. His body slumps to the ground. The uniformed man crouching then stands up.
Now realize that they have policy for this. Remember, even Donald Trump argued that at the border, people are throwing rocks that they could be shot. Like, where do you think that comes from? It's not acceptable. Nobody in any, like, they wouldn't say this on mainstream media because they know that most people would think it's detestable. But they, in plenty of circles, they make arguments. People like Brian Mast will argue they deserved it. That's the kind of thing he's been proudly saying.
This is the spot where Fuad died. The CCTV camera filmed this checkpoint.
I'll just leave it there. I mean, just you make sure you watch this. It's a good breakdown. Sad, disgusting, but it's important. Good in the sense that it's important to understand it's happening. Now, team YouTube here, age restricted the video. Gee, I wonder why. And by the way, it says they also seem to be hiding the share button. Do you realize how disgusting this is? I mean, guys, this is deliberate suppression of provable examples of war crimes. How crazy is that? That's what's happening. It's coordinated. Now, speaking of shooting a kid through the neck, seems to be a pattern. A child is shot in the neck for no reason by Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank. Not Gaza, in the West Bank. He was then detained, not treated, lucky he's still alive, then left at a hospital alone. Now the family has thousands in hospital bills. Normal day for a Palestinian-occupied West Bank.
I was playing on a scooter with my cousin, he says. We were on our way home when we saw an Israeli jeep driving towards us, so we started running. It is an instinct every Palestinian child knows well. Soldiers began shooting, Jude was hit in the neck and fell.
And that's the story, guys. This is reported all across. The point is that they're going to say, well, he was running. I thought he was a terrorist. And that somehow is acceptable to most people that support the Israeli Zionist agenda. In what world does a so-called democracy shoot children in the back, whatever the assumption? This is where we are.
He says in that moment, he felt very far from home. It happened near the Akbat Jabbar refugee camp near Jericho in the occupied West Bank. Soldiers detained the wounded boy, accusing him of throwing rocks and pipe bombs.
See? Because it gets conflated with pipe bombs, even though he was riding a scooter around, that even throwing rocks, think about how crazy that is. And this is acceptable?
Before leaving him at an Israeli hospital. Terrified and alone, it was hours before his family knew where he was.
Every day, whenever they'd administer any kind of treatment, they'd ask my wife to sign bills. They'd say, "We want money, you must pay." They were giving us a really hard time. Every time they'd administer treatment, they made it very difficult.
He's out of the woods but has nerve damage and can't move his left arm. The Israeli hospital where he was treated claims they are owed more than $13,000 for treating an 8-year-old child with a gunshot wound from an Israeli assault rifle. Before Jude was brought back, his family says Israeli hospital staff even tried to take the neck collar, protecting his wound.
My God.
His father says the bill is so high, it will be impossible to pay. Palestinian officials told Al Jazeera that in situations like this, Israel deducts the funds directly from customs taxes that it collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority.
Jesus.
When asked if he was scared, he puts on a brave face.
No.
He says he's looking forward to going home, having a shower, and seeing his grandparents. But he says he'll never ride a scooter again. A lesson every Palestinian child learns too soon. it is never safe to play outside when you live under Israeli occupation. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Ramallah, the occupied West Bank, Palestine.
Here's Rami Abdul from Euromed Human Rights Group. Just a quick side note about West Bank. Israeli Army Central Command Chief points out the army has now stopped regulating Jewish construction in the West Bank. You know, the illegal settlements, which nobody in the world other than Israel argues are legal. Even the U.S. has asked them to tone it down, but of course done nothing to stop it, because go ahead and commit your crimes. We'll just plead with you to stop, but then not do anything to stop you. Sort of like the genocide, which is barely even doing that. But under orders from the Minister of the Ministry of Defense, Benny Gantz, of course. Orders, though, have been issued to enforce the law only on Palestinian construction. So what, can you tell me again out there, world, about how you have equal rights in this place? Where, see, that was the whole lie, is they pretend, they kind of omit the Gaza discussion, acting like they're all equal there, even though that's provably not true. And here's another example. Now, of course, they're going to say it's only because of them, we're evil Palestinians and they're attacking us. And so wait a minute. So at the same time, you're protecting the good ones from the Hamas, but then at the same time, you're collectively adding them all to the same. Every time that happens. If you go through this conversation long enough, the very person acting like they're trying to save the good ones from Hamas will 30 seconds later wipe them all away as all bad people because, well, they voted for him or whatever else. The bottom line is, this is not international law, even domestic law. If you're pretending the laws that are supposed to be there, a democracy or whatever else we're talking about, this is criminal. You're occupying territory that's Palestinian. You are then building on that territory, which even more so is illegal in every possible sense. And then on top of that, you're removing any kind of regulation that might have been there. So now these are the people that are shooting, raping, and pillaging, which most of the corporate media have covered, the illegal settlers. And now they just removed any kind of regulation that might have been there. My God. And only enforcing the law against these bad Palestinians. Welcome to democracy. Here's another example of an individual being shot. Jonas Taurawi. And just another of a countless string of examples of innocent children, unarmed, being shot because they're there and Palestinian. So you can see that he's essentially trying to help what looks like somebody else that was shot and then gets shot, which is what they continue to do. Unarmed. Clearly nothing in his arms. Jonas Taurawi is doing good work on the ground, continuing to cover this stuff. Alon Mizrahi points out, to do this to one child, you need to be a psychopath. To do this to 15,000 children, you need to be a psychopath armed and protected by a superpower. Her name is Rital. She's only 4 years old. She survived an Israeli airstrike on her house in Gaza yesterday. Thank God she's alive. Now, Chris Fitzgerald points out, Israel and its cheerleaders have gone from we don't kill civilians to we kill civilians because they deserve it. Now, this is not a new thing. This has been happening the whole time, but it's good on him to highlight the fact that they're now publishing articles. This is Alan Dershowitz. Just how many of Gazan civilians are entirely innocent? It just really makes my skin crawl. That Dershowitz, of all people, has the gall to stand there on some kind of moral platform and act like you can cast down judgment. How innocent are they? How many of them are entirely innocent? Let me ask you a question. How many human beings are entirely innocent? Especially someone like Alan Dershowitz. How many Americans right now can say I'm entirely innocent? I mean, it just really makes me angry that we're talking about people who are being slaughtered. And you're going to stand back and try, what you're doing right now is trying to justify this, even in some small measure. Well, how many of them are really innocent? This is the worst human being alive in my mind right now. The kind of person that can stand back and know what he's doing and pretend that even if you think everything that ever said is true, that somehow you're going to argue that, well, most of them are pretty gross anyway. That's what you're doing. This person needs to be cast out of society as far as I'm concerned. These are the kind of people that we need to recognize as a problem. Now, I'm being facetious when I say that. My point is that as a reality, we need to highlight that. That's the kind of free speech point I'm making in general. Use the free speech. Make sure you stand there in every possible way and you are a horrible, disgusting, lowest of the low human being. A human being is being kind. Everybody. The problem is there's far too many people in powerful positions and the two-party illusion that will protect people like this, like they protected Epstein, like they protected Weinstein, like they protected a lot of them. Muhammad Shihada points out that on top of all this, after everything, the few examples we just showed you, but they're endless of the murder and the destruction, IDF is admitting Hamas will remain after all this butchering, destruction, and starvation. Hamas will always, as he writes, Hamas was always the pretext. Palestinians are the target. As the article writes, the army admits in a Hebrew article, even after the operations and raids in Rafah, Hamas will remain in the city. By the way, this has been admitted by many different people in the IDF and out. So what's the point? Clearly, it's not about stopping the bad Hamas. It's about destabilization. It is about ethnic cleansing. It is about continued settlements. It is about destroying Palestinian life. And by the way, here's what that looks like. As she writes, this is not a war in Gaza. It's a genocide. Repeat it, spread it, let the world know. This is Khan Yunis for you. Tell me this is not, tell me this is pinpoint targeting Hamas. My God, look at that. I mean, just this first shot right there. Look at that, guys. That is leveled. And then you pull back, it's even more leveled. Further, it's complete, one building standing there. My God. Nobody with compassion or, I shouldn't say things like that. It's just so hard for me emotionally, like to see that anybody can knowingly pretend that this makes sense. Like, I guess I could see somewhere where somebody just somehow doesn't see it because like the media personalities out there that push the lies we just showed you in regard to the numbers and just we're too willfully ignorant to see it. But how anybody who's not just a complete sociopath, psychopath, borderline psychopath can act like this makes sense or even downplay it. Write entire articles about how maybe they're all not that innocent as you might think. Just remember these people. Now, I want to end today with a 6-minute clip about the history of Palestine. Just to remember that this is what we're coming from. This is what it's not just October 7th forward. These people have lived through atrocity after atrocity, and all they do is get gaslit, lied about, called terrorist, suppressed, killed. And then when they do anything to fight back, they get called terrorists yet again. Or even if they fight through some legal channel, they get called terrorists for the BDS movement. They get college kids, Jewish people get called terrorists for standing up for Palestine. Holocaust survivors will get called trash or useless idiots by people like Ben Shapiro, simply because they don't share his Zionist opinions. We need to start calling this stuff out. Find the courage to not be cowed along by threats, false threats of anti-Semitism or racism. You know your heart. You know what you believe in. You know who you care about. Don't let these cowards and subhuman people push you into thinking you're not supposed to call out what is the most obvious thing you've ever seen. Now is the time to find the courage to stand up for the people that desperately need you right now. I was going to get into a point somebody made. I'm going to do it in another show about the Holocaust overlap. And the point being, just this popped in my mind because of it. But the reality of the statement is true. You know what you would have done, whether it's the Holocaust or any other past example. What you're doing now will define how you're looked at in the future. What you would have done, what you're doing now is what you would have done in the face of those atrocities. The point is somebody else, one of these Zionist propagandists, literally on yesterday, which was the anniversary of the Nakba, which historically Israel pushes out all this propaganda about the Holocaust to cover that story. And I just mean propaganda in the sense that, whether true or not is up to you to decide, but that it's to cover the story is my point. But they literally on that day highlighted this saying, here is a woman who got kidnapped on the 7th, showing an image, one of the few that you can see, as much as they try to hype it out as something bigger, and saying, here's a picture of the Holocaust. You now know what you would have done. The nerve of somebody to say that after 7 months of ongoing murder and war crimes that are clearly amounting to genocide, pointing to one day and saying, you now know. If you're not ignoring everything happening in Gaza and only talking about this one day, you now know that you wouldn't have been on the right side. That's what he was doing. And it just really unnerves me to see that people can make those kind of arguments, and that if he believes it, that scares me. If they're lying about it, that's horrifying. Pretending like you are currently on the wrong side of history if you're highlighting the genocide going on. Never again means only care about this one group of people, is apparently what they're saying. The UN representative spoke up and said that recently. I played the clip for you. Never again means attacking anti-Jewish haters. That's basically what he said, paraphrasing. Is that what it means? I thought never again meant don't let genocide happen to anybody. In fact, that's what the honest Jewish people within this community are fully saying right now. The many clips of the Jewish people along the protest, the Holocaust survivors, saying never again means never again for anybody as they point to Israel and what they're doing in Gaza. Time to stand up. Time to find the courage. Thank you for continuing to support this platform, guys. Never be able to fully express how much it means to me that you guys have continued to support us to the point to where we will continue to grow, even in the face of suppression, even in the face of legal attacks and everything else that will probably follow. Thank you. I love you all. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Amid the fabled hills of Judea in Southwest Asia stands Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine.
Palestine was a thriving, populous country with a strong economy, with a political life, with a very strong culture, very diverse, very tolerant, going back as far as history can record.
The British government policy in Palestine, a policy which, if continued, will surely have as a result the replacement of the Arabs by the Jews. The British government imposed the Balfour Declaration, which is abhorred by all Arabs in the Near East.
As a new Jewish state is born.
It's the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic.
A story that will not put up with your game of battle dress, determined to defend the state after so much of struggle and effort and sacrifice and longing prayer through the centuries, that finally, by the grace of God, in reconstruction.
Stop the war in Palestine.
The murder of the United Nations mediator, Count Bernadotte.
Haganah troops have driven the Arabs out of the beleaguered city, taking many prisoners.
Jaffa itself has become an almost deserted city, most of the 70,000 inhabitants having left when the state of Israel was proclaimed.
Entire cities were taken. Entire cities. Haifa, Ramle, Lid, Biafra, Jerusalem, on and on and on. Entire cities.
Your mass media, the Western mass media, always beside the Israelis. And you are forgetting completely this organized terrorism. You refuse to condemn this barbarian attack on the South, but you bless it. And you said that we accept the raid, but it was a little bit more than required.
I don't see any possibility to move forward with the peace process in order to arrive to peace unless all those terrorists will be eliminated.
I came here with the message of peace.
أنا بقول بصوت الأطفال، بصوت النساء، بصوت الرجال، بصوت الشيوخ، بصوت شعبنا كل شعبنا داخل أرضنا المحتلة وخارج أرضنا المحتلة. بقول أن هذه الانتصارات ستستمر حتى انتهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي عن فلسطين، عن أرضنا، عن القدس الشريف.
ونحن نقبل الاحتلال أن يبقى على أرضنا وطننا.
ستكون غزة بإذن الله تعالى مقبرة للغزاة.
وهل أوقفتم يوما مقاومتنا بعدوان أو حصار أو دمار؟ أحشدوا ما شئتم من قوات وأجلبوا بخيلكم ورجلكم برا وبحرا وجوا.
على هذه الأرض سيدة الأرض كانت تسمى فلسطين، صارت تسمى فلسطين أم البدايات، أم النهايات. على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة.
Do you condemn Hamas?
נלחמים בחיות אדם?
We will stand with you in solidarity and we want you to win.
We stand with Israel. شهداء بالعشرات وشرها.
حضرني على أرض صامدة لآخر نقطة دم في روحي، لآخر نفس فيا، لما يعني خلص هيك يبطل فيا نفس أنا خنق أموت، بعديها بندفن حتى في أرضي.